Now, taking a look at the blood vessels and see how they're able to control flow through them, and talk a little bit about the pressure that builds up into them and how we can utilize that to exchange substances between them. And so now to take a look at the actual blood pressure within the vessels themselves and how we come to knowing what that is. And so in terms of blood pressure, this is something that has to be maintained. So we have to maintain essentially that equivalent of something going from 120 millimeters of mercury all the way down to 0 millimeters of mercury throughout the entire system. So coming out of that right ventricle, hitting that 120, and then coming into the I'm sorry, out of the left ventricle, and then coming into the right atrium down to 0 millimeters mercury equivalently. And so getting down to that process itself. Because if we can't maintain that, we can't get the blood to go where we need it to go at any given time. So if it becomes too low, the tissues themselves aren't going to have adequate amounts of flow, which is going to lead to a decrease in oxygen. It's going to lead to a decrease in nutrients that it needs, things like glucose, other micronutrients that are there for the tissues themselves. It's going to lead to an increase in waste products building up in the tissues themselves. And so if we don't have that flow being maintained throughout the tissues, we're going to suffer the consequences of not being able to get things there and not pull things back. But on the converse side, if it goes too high, this is where now the system itself becomes now potentially filled with problems from damage. And so if our pressure has become increased and we have a blood vessel that is normally like so, and our blood pressure has become high and it's now pushing out on it with greater force than it normally would, that can potentially lead that blood vessel to become damaged. It can lead to valves becoming damaged within the blood vessels. It can lead to pressure leading to plaquing forming on the vessels themselves, all potentially leading to vascular issues later on in life. So when we look at blood pressure, what we're looking for are the changes in the blood pressure. When we measure it, we're going to have a number that comes up where we have systolic on top and diastolic on the bottom in terms of the numbers that we get. And so systolic pressure itself is that pressure on the walls of the blood vessels when the ventricles are contracting. So this pressure is going to be rising as those ventricles contract. And so this is where we're going to get up into that 120 millimeters of mercury range. This happens during essentially the equivalent of only a third of the entire cardiac cycle. So this doesn't happen for very long. And so it's a relatively short period of time because from that point on, the pressure is always going to be falling. And so our diastolic pressure coming in at around 80 for that. This is as those ventricles are now, in a sense, empty, even though they're never truly empty. They're refilling, and the blood, as it's moving through the system, is always moving from the heart away. And so the pressure in it is going to be dropping and dropping and dropping until we reach the next contraction. And then that is going to get us to the next point in time where that pressure then starts to rise again and we bring it back up to that 120. The difference between those two numbers is going to equal our pulse pressure. And so our pulse pressure coming in at roughly 40 millimeters of mercury, that is there. And that pulse pressure is the amount of pressure that is generated between diastole and systole. And so the amount of pressure that we're going to bring up the pressure from that point in time where we've reached our lowest amount of arterial pressure, and the ventricle contracts and it gets to its highest point as far as pressure goes. So we measure pressure. We can do this in any artery that we have in the body itself when we're looking at the larger arteries. And so oftentimes we're using the brachial artery for convenience there, but we could even use the femoral artery. We can use radial and ulnar arteries here for that pressure that is there. And effectively what we get is as we blow up that pressure cuff, we're creating a tourniquet or we're creating a valve in the blood vessels. And so by squeezing those blood vessels down, we're generating that pressure that is there. And that's going to drop that blood pressure off. And so once we get above 120 millimeters of mercury, we're no longer going to see any kind of change in the pressure as far as the pressure kind of bounding as we're looking at the gauge itself. That's there. But if we're below that, we're going to see this obvious stretch of systole, and then we're going to see where, as we're going through diastole, the pressure itself starts to fall and fall and fall, and then it comes back up and we have another contraction. So our pressure goes back up and we hit that 120 point, and then it comes back down, and then it comes back up and goes back down. And so we're always having essentially kind of like these big pressure balls or these pressure waves going through the vessel itself. Every time we have contraction, and this pressure wave is going to be traveling along that artery that we have there. And so in order to find out our pulse pressure, we again take the systolic pressure, subtract the diastolic pressure, and then we have our pulse pressure from that. So roughly 40 millimeters of mercury becomes our average pulse pressure that we're going to see inside the blood vessels themselves. So what factors determine blood pressure? With this, we're going to have things like cardiac output, and so how much blood is actually leaving, and so that 70 milliliters with each contraction times our heart rate is going to equal approximately 5.25, not milliliters, but liters. Within that, our peripheral resistance, and so what is being measured as far as the amount of resistance is inside those vessels, not something that we can easily calculate. And then volume of the blood itself. Do we have 5 liters of blood, or do we have an increase or a decrease in that volume? And so are we overhydrated? Do we have retention of water, things like that? Or have we lost volume? Is our blood volume decreasing because we've lost some blood somewhere? So cardiac output itself is relatively easy to calculate in general. And so we're going to have our heart rate somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 beats a minute times our stroke volume of 70 milliliters on those. And we're going to come up with the general of our 5 liters or so per minute for our cardiac output. And so the more that we have there, if our cardiac output increases, this is potentially going to increase our blood pressure. And so cardiac output is going to have that influence on it. The more that we're pushing out into there, especially if we increase our stroke volume, that's going to potentially increase our change in the pulse pressure itself. From there, we have the diameter of the vessels themselves. So what's our peripheral resistance? And so since diameter is the ultimate changer as far as our ability to change peripheral resistance, we can't really change blood viscosity very readily within the blood. But again, if we've lost volume within the body itself, and so if we've lost blood volume, or if we're retaining water, those both can have a detrimental effect on the blood viscosity. But overall, we're going to change the diameter in order to change our resistance. And so we can either do vasoconstriction or vasodilation to either increase the resistance or reduce the resistance that's there. And so even if cardiac output increases, this may lead us to a vasodilation in order to offset that increase in blood pressure so that our blood pressure isn't just going crazy through the roof every time that our cardiac output goes up. Blood volume in and of itself changes the viscosity of the blood itself. 4 things. And so this can be due to problems within the body. As I said, this can be due to if we have increased amounts, we can have things like water retention, venous pooling. We could have dehydration, which is going to decrease our volume that is there. And so both of those are going to lower or raise our pressure. And so here we're going to have a decrease in blood pressure. Here we're going to have an increase in blood pressure because we have more fluid volume there within the body themselves for those. And next time we'll start to continue to take a look at blood pressure and how it changes with regulations of the within both internal and external forces.